The sun was a fading memory, slipping behind the jagged edges of the rocky cliffs as the evening chill began to bite. The temperature in the valley was dropping fast, the air growing thick and heavy. Tonight, we were out on patrol, keeping our eyes peeled. The enemy had been targeting convoys and planting IEDs along this stretch of land, making life hell for our boys. The whole company was spread out along the valley, staying away from the villages and small hamlets. We were positioned silently, waiting for a signal. "Damn, it's freezing out here. You good?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. A few soldiers gave me a thumbs up, their faces glowing faintly in the dim light. As the medic, it was my job to keep everyone hydrated and ready to move. I'd remind them about water so often, sometimes I thought they were just tuning me out on purpose. A crackling voice over the radio broke the silence. "We've got eyes on a vehicle," it said. We stopped in our tracks and took cover behind a rocky outcropping. The LT and a few others raised their binoculars, scanning the distance, but even from here, we could see the headlights cutting through the dark. "Looks like he's laying an IED. Do we engage?" a sergeant asked. "Negative. We observe and report," came the LT's calm response. I leaned back against the rock, staring up at the sky. Back home, the city lights always drowned out the stars. But out here, the sky was clearer than I could remember. I nudged the soldier next to me. "Big Dipper," I said, pointing upward. He followed my finger and nodded. Not that I was an expert, but I recognized the familiar shape. First platoon spotted a convoy of enemy vehicles moving east. "Looks like they're setting up in a village over there," the LT said, his voice low. My stomach twisted into a knot. I wasn't the only one feeling it. "All right, battalion wants us to regroup with the others. They're gearing up for something big. Let's move." There were a few muttered groans as we started marching. We ducked down several times as enemy vehicles passed below us, their lights out, sneaking toward the target. I could feel it, something big was coming. "What do you think's going down?" I asked, falling into step with the LT. "Can't say. Document looks like they're preparing for something. We've got outposts all around here. Any one of them could be the target. But battalion's not picking up any chatter." I nodded. That meant we hit them first, before they could get the jump on us. Seems fair. We met up with 1st and 3rd platoons, and 4th was still on the way. Far enough out that a few Humvees, lights off, could still be used to transport us. The LTs and sergeants gathered to formulate a plan, quickly relaying it back to HQ. I made my rounds. "Stay hydrated, fellas. How's your back? Feet doing all right? Did you change your socks?" Every guy had their aches and pains, and I was well-versed in all of them. It was my job to know. I gave each of them a fist bump, a pat on the shoulder, anything to break the silence. I could see the tension in their faces, but I kept things light. "All right, listen up," the LT called out. 4th platoon's on their way. When they get here, we move. "Doc, you and your squad stay put. You'll be the aid station." I felt my gut tighten. "Sir, I need to be with you. What's the evac plan if things go south?" "No can do. Battalion's directive. You're staying back, and 4th's bringing medical supplies along with a medical officer. He'll be in charge of the field." The LT's tone left no room for argument. I gritted my teeth but nodded. "Yes, sir." As the platoons moved out, the ground shook with the force of artillery strikes. It was a sight to see, powerful but unsettling. Once the barrage was over, the infantry climbed into their vehicles and roared off toward the enemy. Meanwhile, I and a handful of medics stayed behind. I approached the officer overseeing the aid station. Talking to a full bird always made me uneasy, but tonight it felt worse. "Evening, sir," I said with a lazy wave. "Evening, son. How are you holding up?" He was calm, but I could see the edge in his eyes. I shrugged. "Tired, but ready," I replied. He gave me a tight smile. "Let's get set up. Grab those boxes." Soon enough, we had our station ready, though calling it an aid station felt generous. We drove tent poles into the rocky earth, stretched tarps over them, and set up a couple of gurneys and 4 stands. I did a quick mental inventory of what we had and what we still needed. "What are we expecting for casualties?" I asked, the weight of it starting to settle in. Intel says we'll see about 10 to 15% casualties. The village is crawling with enemy forces. Our guys are good at what they do, though. No need to worry, he said with a laugh, but it sounded forced. I knew better. He'd seen enough combat to know it was never that simple. Gunfire erupted in the distance, followed by explosions that lit up the night. It started, the officer muttered, his voice grim. Get me the radio. We tuned in, listening to the chatter. The platoons had surrounded the village, but they were pinned down by enemy machine gun nests and fortified positions. From what I could gather, 3rd Platoon was taking the brunt of it on the north side. I bounced my leg nervously, my mind racing. The officer placed a steadying hand on my shoulder. We're gonna be busy real soon. Get ready, he said. I nodded, trying to steady my breath. You'll be in charge of that station. He pointed to the far end of the tent. Sir, I don't know if I should be in charge, I said, half laughing. You're a junior NCO, son. These guys may know their stuff, but they're lacking leadership. That's why I requested you. I've seen you work. My heart skipped. He asked for me? I barely contained my surprise. Yes, sir. I'll do my best. That's why I requested you. Now, let's get to work, he said, fist bumping me. I never liked being in charge of an aid station. It was the dirtiest job for a medic, waiting for the injured to be brought in while the battle raged on. Injuries would be treated in the field, but the serious cases, the ones that took soldiers out of the fight, were our responsibility. Those wounded would be evacuated out and sent to us. Today's ambulance was a beaten-up Humvee, affectionately called the Buggy. Bullet holes and fluid leaks told the tale of its survival, but it had made it through everything Afghanistan threw at it. It was a tank on wheels, exactly what a soldier would want. After what felt like an eternity, the radio crackled again. Man down, man down. The voice was frantic. Get him out of here. Contact left. A few soldiers spoke briefly with the officer before jumping into the Humvee, their M2 Modus .50 caliber machine gun roaring to life. They were going after that soldier, no matter what. The sound of the Modus faded into the chaos of the battle, becoming just another thread in the web of gunfire and explosions. The weight was unbearable. What was the injury? Would he make it to evac in time? I triple-checked our setup, though I knew it was perfect for now. Once the injured began arriving, it'd look like a war zone, inevitable, but still a grim reality. The Humvee came skidding down the rocky path, coming to a halt with a screech. We've got three, a sergeant shouted, leaping from the vehicle. I rushed over to help unload the soldiers from the back of the Humvee. Blood pooled in the metal, slick and dark under the dim light that barely filtered through the glow of our setup tent. None of them were moving. The drive back had only taken 10 minutes or so, but every second counted when lives were hanging in the balance. The first soldier had a sucking chest wound, half bandaged. Whoever had done it had no idea what they were doing. It wasn't helping. The officer and another soldier moved in quickly to work on him. The second soldier had taken a hit in the lower back, piercing his armor. He was conscious, but couldn't move. I prayed it wasn't a spinal injury. I turned to the third soldier as I worked on the second. This guy had taken a grenade or rocket blast. His body was a mangled mess, half-burned and peppered with shrapnel. A few others jumped in to help with him. I peeled my patient's vest off. We talked through everything, me guiding him while I monitored his vitals. His pulse was rapid and blood was pooling around the wound. I ordered my assistant to turn him gently. We flipped him over, I cut off his shirt, and started cleaning the injury. A bullet had lodged itself in a vertebra, requiring surgery that was way beyond what I could do. I told him as much. Fuck, document. I can't feel my legs. I can't walk, he groaned. I know, buddy. Just stay calm. Deep breaths, I said. We packed the wound as best we could, stabilizing him for now. I kept my voice calm, but inside, my heart was pounding. Sweat soaked through my shirt despite the cool air. The officer finished with his patient and ran over to me. What's the situation? He asked. I explained what was going on, and he cursed under his breath. I'll radio it in. We need evac now. The first 3 needed to be out ASAP. ETA was 15 minutes. The birds in the sky would be working overtime tonight. First platoon has 2 down. Need evac, came the voice over the radio. The transport team jumped into action. The distant thud of the chopper grew louder as the Humvee sped off again. The officer gave the order to drop off the injured, then get back as quickly as possible. We loaded the soldiers into the chopper, and it lifted off, disappearing into the night sky. I've always liked watching the helicopters and gunships soar through the sky, but tonight I dreaded it. The noise of the rotors wasn't the reassuring sound of support, it was the sound of a life on the line. The Humvee screeched to a halt again. 2 more injured. My heart dropped, but there was no time to waste. We moved them onto the gurneys. One had taken several rounds to the leg, a mangled mess of flesh and bone. He wouldn't keep the leg, but at least he wouldn't die from it. The second had been hit by another grenade. I found out later he'd grabbed it as it landed and threw it back, but it detonated midair, showering him with shrapnel. His face was a nightmare, bleeding, torn up, and his upper body was shredded. I worked on the leg injury while the officer focused on the grenade victim. The others at the station rushed to help. I did my best to steady my trembling hands, but everything was covered in blood. I'd already discarded my uniform top, but the heat of the chaos didn't help. Sweat beaded on my forehead, and the smell of iron in the air made my stomach churn. The soldiers working with me were just as rattled. Hands shaking, tools dropping, nerves unraveling. We worked on the leg for what felt like hours. I pulled bullet fragments out, packed the wounds, and kept talking to him to calm him down. Finally, we wrapped him up. The chopper touched down once more. The officer wasn't done with his patient, but he was stable enough for transport. We loaded him up and sent him off. The officer slapped me on the shoulder as we walked back. "You doing okay, son?" he asked, eyeing me over. I looked like I'd been through a meat grinder, but I tried to smile. "All good, sir," I lied. "Where are you from, soldier?" he asked as we took a quick breather, hydrating and lighting up a cigarette. I declined, as usual. "Louisiana, sir," I replied. He nodded and took a drag. "Been there." "New Orleans." I watched the chopper's flashing lights disappear into the distance. 2 hours east of where I'm from, I said. People always assumed New Orleans was the only place in Louisiana. We talked for a bit, then returned to our stations. "Cool dude." "All right, guys, gather up," I said as I pulled my team together. "How are we doing?" The men mumbled, "We're fine," but I could tell they were running on fumes. "Listen, drink some water and help me clean up. We've got this, all right?" They nodded. Technically, I had more experience than most of them, despite being younger. Most of these men hadn't seen real combat before, and we'd been thrown into the deep end. They'd been brought in as medical support because combat operations in the valley were escalating. We were in the heart of it, a place they called Heart of Darkness. And every day we survived, it proved the name was right. One of the younger guys pulled me aside. "You've been here a while, right?" he asked. I shrugged. "Yeah, about 5 or 6 months." "Why?" He shook his head. "How the hell do you get through this?" "I'm here to do my job, but damn, I don't know if I can handle this." I gave him a weak smile and clapped him on the shoulder. "We're here to save lives. Focus on your job, on your training. We're a team. Don't be afraid to ask for help. If you find yourself in the fight, you'll know what to do. It becomes second nature." He smiled weakly. I didn't feel like I was motivating anyone, but it seemed to help him. "Let's get prepped," I said, turning back to the cleanup. "Second platoon has 2 injured. Evac required." A lump caught in my throat. That was my platoon. I wasn't there. The Humvee, now a grim, bloodied mess, roared off again. "You boys are doing a damn fine job," the officer said as we waited. "Damn fine." I nodded, but each radio call dug deeper into my chest. I felt useless. I should be out there, with my guys, taking shots and dealing with injuries in the field. But aid station duty? That was the real test. It was the waiting that really got to me. The unknown. The waiting. The relentless race against the clock. It was the kind of intensity that branded itself into your soul, and I can still feel it now, that tightness in my chest. The adrenaline peaks and crashes when that Humvee rolled back in, it hit you fast and hard, draining you in waves. And roll back, and it did too this time. The officer had taken another sucking chest wound, and we had our hands full with the other one. The bullet had ripped through his abdomen, tearing right through. Intestines, spleen, there was no telling the damage. His pulse was weak, but his eyes darted around, mouth mumbling something incoherent. Fading fast. We moved quick. I went to work on him, trying to stem the bleeding. My guys were handing me sterilized gauze by the handful, but it wasn't enough. Nothing seemed to help. But eventually, we got it under control. He was bad, real bad. A machine gunner from 2nd Platoon. I knew him, though not well enough to have asked more about him. Funny guy, lanky with that Midwestern drawl. We'd joke whenever we ran into each other. No matter where we were, it'd light up the place. I regretted not knowing more about him. Found out later he made it back to base and would survive. He'd leave the desert for good after that. I wrote his family a letter personally. I figured, if I couldn't save his life, I'd at least offer them some words. He'd been through hell, but he was going home. Once they were loaded up, the fighting started to wind down. The enemy had tried to pull back, only to be caught by our guys and wiped out. Some surrendered, but most preferred death over capture. Another battle won. The officer came around, shaking hands, offering words of thanks. But he pulled me aside that morning, just as the first light began to break over the horizon. I'll never forget what he said to me. "Son," he started, "you're one hell of a medic. Been here a while, huh?" I nodded. 5, 6 months, sir." He slapped a hand on my shoulder, my body shaking with exhaustion. "You're a damn good soldier. Took charge tonight and saved some lives. I want you to know, if you ever need anything, you come find me. I see a hell of a future for you in this army, son." His words hit me like a shot to the chest. As bad as everything was, the blood, the fire, the constant weight of it, those words of encouragement pulled me up when I thought I couldn't keep going. Later, I'd find out he'd recommended me for an Army Commendation Medal, Arkham, for that night. It wasn't something I took lightly, but receiving it after my tour, it was bittersweet. So many of my brothers got hurt. They didn't deserve it. I couldn't save them all. And that's the hardest part. I didn't feel like I deserved that medal or any of the others that followed. They're not victories, they're painful reminders. Every time I see them, it brings me back to those moments I can't forget. I almost wish I hadn't received them. Maybe then, I wouldn't feel that ache, that constant weight of loss, that burden I've carried for more than a decade now. People like to call me a hero when they find out about my time overseas. But a hero doesn't quit after 4 years. I did. I had to. I was broken, mentally and physically. "Thank you for your service," they say. What do I say to that? You're welcome. I wasn't a hero. I was just doing my job, trying to get home, and trying to bring my boys home, too. Through all the blood and the bullets, the pain and the triumph, the sleepless nights and the endless mornings, we'd built something stronger than family, a brotherhood forged in fire. And I'm grateful for the chance to serve alongside those real heroes. I'll never see myself as more than a medic, just a guy who did his job. One who still carries the weight of survivors' guilt and depression, dragging myself through the aftermath of hell. But I'm here. I'm fighting my way back. Every day is a step forward, trying to heal the mental and physical scars from all those nights with names I'll never know, faces I couldn't save. Thank you for reading. If there's one thing I want you to take from all this, it's this. Real heroes are the ones who paid the ultimate price. The ones who sacrificed everything for duty and love of country. Those are the ones we remember. Those are the ones I try to honor every day. The days after that night felt like they moved in slow motion. The adrenaline was gone, but the weight of it never really left. I'd wake up from nightmares, the sounds of the battlefield echoing in my head, the faces of the fallen flashing in front of my eyes. I'd reach for my rifle instinctively, then realize I was no longer there, no longer in that hell. But the ghosts stayed. They followed me everywhere. Back at the base, there was the quiet. A different kind of chaos. The kind that comes from being surrounded by too much time and not enough to do with it. You try to fill it with anything: poker games, lifting weights, talking about anything but the things you've seen. But when the lights went down and the hum of the generators died down for the night, the quiet would creep in, and that's when the thoughts would start swirling. There were days when it was almost easier to pretend none of it happened. To act like it was just another deployment, another part of the job. But deep down, I knew better. You can only bury it for so long before it starts to crack through the surface. It wasn't just the guilt that ate at me. It was the feeling that, no matter what I did, no matter how many lives I saved, I couldn't shake the sense of helplessness. There were too many that I couldn't save. Too many that never made it back. And then, just when I thought I might crack from the weight of it all, we got another mission. Another call. It was just like the others. Another ambush waiting to happen, another dust up in the middle of nowhere. But this time it was different. This time, the stakes felt higher. I could feel it in my gut the minute I was told. The guys were gearing up, preparing for another round of chaos, and I couldn't shake the sense of dread that had settled over me. I should have trusted that feeling. The convoy rolled out in the early hours of the morning. The sun hadn't even started to rise yet, just the dark, empty stretch of road ahead. Everything felt surreal. Quiet. Too quiet. We'd barely gone a few miles when it happened. The blast hit us like a hammer. The first thing I remember is the deafening sound of the explosion. The air rushing past my ears, followed by the sickening thud of the Humvee flipping over. We were all over the place, disoriented, trying to get a grip on the situation. I remember yelling at the guys to move, to get the hell out of the vehicle, but my voice barely made it out over the ringing in my ears. My body reacted before my mind could process what was going on. I was out of the Humvee, weapon in hand, moving instinctively to the nearest wounded. My heart was pounding, adrenaline already starting to flood my system. It was all too familiar. The sights, the sounds, the smell of burning metal and blood. I didn't even think about the incoming fire, the rounds whizzing past my head. I didn't think about the possibility of more IEDs in the area. All that mattered was the next wounded soldier, the next person who needed my help. I found him, one of the grunts from 1st Platoon, barely conscious, bleeding from a wound in his side. His chest was rising and falling weakly, but he was still alive. Just barely. "Stay with me, man," I said, my voice rough as I tried to stop the bleeding. The guy barely looked at me, his eyes wide with fear and pain. I worked fast, doing what I could. My hands were shaking, but I wasn't thinking about that. I was thinking about getting him back to the medevac, getting him out of this hell. The gunfire was heavy now, the enemy wasn't done with us yet. It felt like the world was coming apart around me. I looked around for the others. More wounded. More chaos. More blood. We were in the middle of a firefight, and I was alone in the thick of it. The enemy was in the hills, moving fast, but we couldn't move. We had to hold the line, get these guys back to safety. "Doc, over here." It was one of the other medics, a guy named Garcia, waving me over. His hands were already covered in blood. I rushed to him, my heart pounding in my chest. "What's the sitrep?" I asked as I crouched next to him. "We've got 2 more down, and I can't get to them alone." "We need backup," he said, his voice low, almost drowned out by the sound of gunfire. I didn't hesitate. I nodded, turning my head to the soldiers closest to us. "Cover fire. Now!" I shouted, motioning for them to keep the enemy's heads down while we moved. There was no room for fear now. Only action. I wasn't thinking about what could happen to me. All I cared about was getting those 2 soldiers to safety. We moved quickly, but it felt like we were in slow motion. Every step was weighed down by the weight of what we were facing. Another explosion rocked the ground beneath us, but we kept going, pushing forward. We got to the downed soldiers and started working on them, doing what we could under fire. I remember looking up, my hands covered in someone else's blood, seeing the enemy on the move. They were closer now, and we were exposed. We needed to move, but there was no time. Garcia's voice cut through the chaos. "We need a medevac now." I grabbed the radio. "This is document. We need a bird, we're taking fire. Send a bird now." The response came quick, but the wait felt like an eternity. We were sitting ducks out there. I didn't care about the medals or recognition. I didn't care about anything except getting these soldiers out alive. The sound of the helicopter was a godsend. Finally, we had our chance. We worked fast, getting the wounded onto the chopper and sending them off. More rounds hit the ground around us as we pulled back, the firefight still raging in the distance. But I didn't stop to look back. We had done our job, for today at least. As the helicopter lifted off, I couldn't help but think of the soldiers still in the fight, still out there. There were more of them, more lives at stake, more battles to fight. And no matter how much I wanted to quit, how much I wanted to walk away from all of it, I knew I couldn't. Not yet. There would always be another mission, another fight. But this time, I had a new understanding. No matter what the cost, no matter how much it hurt, I couldn't back down. Not when there were soldiers still out there counting on me. The battlefield had become a blur of smoke, fire, and blood. Every step I took felt like a fight for survival. I had learned to move instinctively, to block out the noise of the war around me, but it was getting harder to ignore. My body ached with exhaustion, my mind barely holding onto the thread of sanity that had kept me grounded for months. There was no escaping the violence, no place to hide from the screams, the shouts, or the reality that we were all just living on borrowed time. It was like any other day, but I could feel something different in the air. The tension had thickened overnight. The calm before the storm. I could almost taste it. My gut told me we weren't going to make it out of this one. We were heading out again on a convoy mission. The chatter on the radio was nonstop, but it felt distant, muffled. I wasn't listening as closely as I should have been. My thoughts kept drifting back to the guys we'd already lost, those that would never make it home. I could still hear their voices, their laughter echoing in my mind like ghosts. I had to push that out. I couldn't afford to be distracted now. The mission was simple. Move in, secure the area, and get the civilians out of the danger zone. We had done it 100 times before, but this time it felt different. The landscape was too quiet, the air too still. The moment we moved out, I knew something was off. We had barely crossed the first stretch of road when the explosion tore through the Humvee in front of us. The blast lifted the vehicle off the ground, tossing it like a toy. I barely had time to react before we were plunged into chaos. The sound of gunfire erupted from all directions. The dust from the explosion mixed with the gunpowder, making it hard to see. I could hear the shouts of the guys around me, but it was like everything was happening underwater. The adrenaline surged, and I moved on pure instinct. Medic. It was a voice I recognized, Sergeant Miller. His voice was strained, his breath coming in short gasps. I didn't hesitate. I sprinted toward him, my heart pounding in my chest. Miller was down, his leg shredded by shrapnel from the explosion. The blood was pouring out of him, but he was conscious, still fighting. "Doc, get me out of here," he gasped. His voice was weak, but there was determination in his eyes. "We're gonna get you out of here, Sarge," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I was already working, tearing open the medkit, trying to stem the bleeding, but there was so much blood and not enough time. The firefight raged on around us. I could see the flashes of enemy gunfire in the distance, but I couldn't afford to think about it. I had one job, keep Miller alive long enough to get him back to the medevac. I kept working, but it wasn't enough. The blood wouldn't stop. I could hear Miller's breathing becoming more labored, his voice getting quieter. "Doc, you've got this. Stay with me, Sergeant," I said, trying to keep him focused. "I'm not leaving you." But as I worked, I could feel the pressure building in my chest. This wasn't the first time I'd been this close to death, but this time felt different. There was something in the air, something in the way the world seemed to slow down around me. The dust, the smoke, the noise, it all felt like it was closing in. "Doc," Garcia shouted from behind me. "We need to move. Now." I didn't want to leave Miller. I didn't want to abandon him, but I knew Garcia was right. If we didn't get out of here, we'd all be dead. "Help me get him on the stretcher," I shouted. Garcia and I worked quickly, pulling Miller onto the stretcher, but before we could move, another explosion rocked the ground beneath us. The force of it knocked us all to the ground. I lost my grip on Miller, and he slid out of my reach, the stretcher slipping from my hands. For a moment, everything went still. My vision blurred, and I felt the sting of blood in my mouth. My My head was spinning, and I couldn't tell if it was from the blast or from the weight of everything that had happened. "Doc, stay with us," Garcia shouted, pulling me up from the ground. But I couldn't stay with them. I could feel the blood rushing from my head, my vision narrowing, my chest tightening. I was losing it. I tried to stand, but my legs buckled beneath me. The world spun faster, my body moving like it wasn't mine anymore. I heard Garcia's voice, but it was distant, fading. Everything went black. When I woke up, the world was quieter. I could hear the sound of my breath, shallow and ragged, but it didn't feel like my own. My body felt heavy, like I was floating outside of it. I blinked several times, trying to focus, trying to get my bearings, but all I could see was a haze of gray. "Doc," someone whispered. "Doc, stay with me. Don't you dare leave me, you hear me?" It was Garcia. He sounded panicked. I tried to lift my hand, to signal that I was okay, but nothing happened. My fingers wouldn't move. I couldn't feel them. My chest was tight, suffocating. I managed to take a shallow breath. It felt like it took all my energy. I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. My mouth was dry, my throat raw. I could feel something wet against my cheek. "Doc, come on, stay with us, man. We're not losing you too." The pain in my chest was overwhelming. My breath came in ragged gasps, like I was drowning, like my body was shutting down. I tried to focus, tried to keep my eyes open, but I could feel the darkness pulling at me. It was like a siren's call, drawing me in. The war, the blood, the faces of the fallen, they were all swirling in my mind, just out of reach. I wanted to remember them, but I couldn't. They were slipping away, and I was too tired to hold on. "Doc," Garcia's voice was breaking now, his words cracking with desperation. "Don't go, man. You can't leave us. You're a damn hero. We need you." I wanted to tell him I wasn't a hero. I was just doing my job. I wanted to tell him to take care of the guys, to be strong. But the words wouldn't come. All I could do was listen as the darkness closed in. I felt the weight of the years, the pain, the loss. It was all coming down on me at once. I had done everything I could. I had tried to save as many as I could, but it wasn't enough. I wasn't enough. And then, just like that, everything went silent. It was over. The battle. The pain. The suffering. My life. Somewhere in the chaos of that battlefield, I had become one of the fallen. Another casualty of war. But maybe, in the end, that's what we all were. Just pieces in a never-ending cycle of violence, trying to do what we could in the time we had. And in the end, all we left behind were the memories of the ones we tried to save, and the ones we couldn't.